I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, Russia unleashes a deadly strike against the western city of Lviv, killing civilians and devastating parts of the historic centre. We also report on the ongoing reshuffle in Ukraine's government and analyse how Germany seems to be standing in the way of a Czech bid to limit EU travel of Russian spies.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 4th of September, 2 years and 198 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls and Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine and Russia.
Well, hi David. Hello team. A Russian strike in the early hours of today in the city of Lviv, so 500 k's west of Kyiv, only 70 kilometres from the border with Poland, has killed at least 7 civilians and injured 64. That number's just gone up in the last few minutes. So this comes from Lviv Oblast authorities. Around 50 buildings, including several near the central railway station, were hit, as were an art centre and 3 schools. You'll remember the new school year began in Ukraine just 2 days ago. Governor Maxim Kozytsky said the attack damaged buildings in the historical centre of the city in an area that's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. President Zelensky said, "Everyone who convinces our partners to give Ukraine greater range to respond to this terror is helping to prevent Russian terrorist attacks on Ukrainian cities." There are children among those killed. There is harrowing footage online of a girl said to be 9 years old, carried dead out of the rubble. The Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs posted a still image of that recovery of the girl. It is hard to look at, but I think it's done with dignity. Certainly the people carrying her out were acting with dignity. And I think the posting of the image by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was sensitive and I think necessary. I think it's important to show. There are images on social media of a family of 5, a mother, father, and 3 daughters, all of whom were killed, less the father, Yaroslav. I don't think that the girl that's carried out by the emergency services is from that family, but we're not sure. Now, then, multiple casualties were also reported in Kryvyi Rih, the city in the south of the country, about 400 kilometers south of Kyiv, when a hotel, 10 high-rise buildings and 4 educational institutions were hit. That reporting comes from Kyiv Independent. And there were explosions also overnight in other cities, including Kyiv, Sumy, Lutsk and Rivne. Those last 2, also in the west of the country, about 350 k's west of Kyiv. Now, in total last night, Russia is thought to have fired 2 Kh-47 Kinzhal missiles launched from the MiG-31K jet, adding to the argument of kill the archer, not the arrow. They also fired 8 cruise missiles launched from the long-range Tupolev bombers and 3 ground-launched Iskander-K cruise missiles, as well as 29 Shahed drones. Ukrainian air defences say they intercepted 22 of the 29 drones, 4 of the 6 air-launched cruise missiles, and all 3 Iskander-K missiles. That's the Air Force reporting that this morning. They say 6 drones were lost, likely as a result of electronic warfare. 1 went a bit rogue and flew back towards Belarus, the Air Force said in a statement. Now, yesterday, you'll remember that attack on Poltava. The death toll from that attack has risen to 53. This comes from Ukraine's State Emergency Service reporting this morning. They say a further 298 people have been injured. You'll remember Russia launched 2 ballistic missiles against the city yesterday, hitting the Military Institute of Communications and a neighbouring medical facility. Moscow has said it did it, said that they launched a precision strike on the 179th Joint Training Centre. Now, Alexander Koruzhny, who's a spokesperson for the Ukraine State Emergency Service, speaking on national TV, said the rescuers worked all night, organised into shifts. And Dmitry Lazukhin, who's the Defence Ministry spokesman, then said that there were no ceremonies or other events near the military institute at the time of the attack, refuting claims that have been going around on social media and what have you. The suggestion that there was a big parade or that there were lots of people out and about and not obviously paying attention. Now, elsewhere in Ukraine, let's go down to the Donbass and in particular the Pokrovsk area where a Russian assault is continuing. Yesterday, just to try and situate us on the map, yesterday we reported that Ukrainian forces had regained positions in southwestern Novorodivka. That's about 10 k's southeast of Pokrovsk. They were also thought to be building up positions in Marinivka, a further 2 kilometers due south, and Russian forces had been seen in the vicinity of Mikhailivka. That's about 4 k's south of that. Now, geolocated footage from yesterday, coming from the Institute for the Study of War, shows Russian forces have moved into southwest Halitsinivka. That's 5 k's southeast of Mikhailivka, where some Russian elements were reported yesterday. And the ISW, citing Russian sources, say that other Russian units have been seen in Novelsk. That's about just a few kilometers southeast of that, back towards Donetsk city. Now, that line through those villages that I've just mentioned there, if you look at them on the map, that seems to be the left flank of this Russian bulge towards Pokrovsk. It roughly parallels the main road in the area, running from Donetsk city to Pokrovsk. The road is actually about a kilometre or so inside the bulge, so these might be sort of outer flank protection elements that are being reported, suggesting that road might be the main access route for the left flank. Now, if so, it is vulnerable, it is extended, but it's somewhat protected by the Vovcha River, which is a little bit further to the southwest, and a bit like the lodgement up in the Kursk region. Now, Ukrainian forces wouldn't want to get trapped in there between the Vovcha River and this Russian bulge. It's obviously also an obstacle to have to cross to counterattack if Russia were able to expand its current positions. There's no guarantee of that. They are inching forward, and there's quite some bit of ground between where they are now and the river. But I'm just looking at the map and noting what might be a sensible military objective. Now, up into Kursk, and Ukraine has vowed to hold the territory it's captured up there indefinitely. President Zelensky has refused to rule out taking any more land as well. He was speaking to NBC News. President Zelensky said, "We don't need their land. We don't want to bring our Ukrainian way of life there, but Kyiv will keep control of the land as part of the victory plan, which Mr. Zelensky says will end the war." He said, "For now, we need Kursk." Clashes were reported there yesterday in the region, but no significant alterations to positions in either direction, or in any direction from either side. And then just finally for me, David, Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office said yesterday that Russia has executed 3 Ukrainian prisoners of war near Toretsk in the Donetsk Oblast. They have launched an investigation into this alleged incident after a video circulated on Telegram purporting to show 3 Ukrainian soldiers coming out of a basement with their hands up, after which they were apprehended by Russian soldiers, placed down on the ground and shot. I think that takes to 50, maybe 60 formal investigations into alleged executions of prisoners that the Prosecutor General's office has launched. And that's us up to date, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for all of those updates. We'll come back to you later. But Joe Barnes, our Brussels correspondent, can I come to you next? Would you start just by talking us through this incredibly large reshuffle in the Ukrainian government? Joe, what have you been looking at?
Yep. Hi, folks. I do think it's right that we touch on the huge government reshuffle being undertaken by Volodymyr Zelensky. We have at least 6 high-profile casualties who have handed in their letters of resignation. That's according to Ruslan Stefanchuk, the Speaker of Ukraine's Parliament. In my opinion, and perhaps the person I've had sort of the most dealing with out of the group, is Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. Ukraine's top diplomat, apart from Zelensky, is probably the most recognisable face of this Ukrainian wartime cabinet, perhaps because of his most articulate and fluently spoken English, his relentless travels across the world, sort of lobbying for sanctions against Moscow, deliveries of humanitarian and military aid to Kyiv. The list of resignations includes 2 deputy prime ministers, 3 ministers, as well as the Ukrainian State Property Fund chief, so the head of the Ukrainian State Property Fund. This is what Zelensky had to say about it. He said the overhaul would, and I quote, give strength, end quote, Ukraine's institutions. And this is a quote from him from his nightly video address on Tuesday night. And he said, "Autumn will be extremely important for Ukraine, and our state institutions must be set up in such a way that Ukraine will achieve all the results we need for all of us. To do this, we need to strengthen some areas in the government, and personal decisions have been prepared." So it's really interesting, this reshuffle, a sort of massive news. It comes at a really, really interesting time. So sources in Ukraine do suggest that this has been sort of months in the planning, but you have to look at its announcement. It comes at a time when you have this perilous nature of Russia's advances in eastern Ukraine, mainly on the Donetsk region city of Pokrovsk, as Dom was alluding to earlier. You've got the recent bombing campaign, which last week saw sort of 200 missiles and more than 200 missiles and drones aimed at Ukrainian cities. You've got this bombing in Lviv that has left sort of children killed. You have yesterday the over 50 people killed in Poltava after the military training academy was targeted by Russian ballistic missiles. That's prompted sort of plenty of criticism of Zelensky's government. And then on the other hand, you have Ukrainian forces occupying part of Kursk. You have Zelensky planning this trip to Washington to deliver this, as he calls it, a victory plan to Biden, and then the next presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. But let's touch on a few of the people and the names involved. I've drawn up what we call pen portraits in newspaper parlance, or small illustrations of the people who I think are most important in this. So we've got Dmytro Kuleba, as I said, he's an articulate speaker, fluent in English. When he's sort of always been, as Ukraine's top foreign diplomat, the foreign minister, has been on the road a hell of a lot. When Russian troops poured over Ukraine's borders on February the 24th, 2022, he was actually in Washington sort of trying to lobby for US support. He was a qualified lawyer. At just 38, he was appointed by Volodymyr Zelensky as foreign minister, making him the youngest person to ever be appointed in that role. But I must say, one of the reasons and hints that he has been sort of let go is, one, there's been long-term speculation over his departure, sort of dating back to August last year. Some have described it as potentially a bit of a power struggle between Zelensky's office and the foreign ministry. He has sort of failed, as of yet, to secure looser restrictions on the use of Storm Shadow and ATACMS from the UK and US. And while he secured a number of promises on this initiative to secure extra Patriot systems for Ukraine, he complained last week while in Brussels that basically countries that have made those promises weren't delivering on those promises. So potentially there could be some performance-related issues here. His likely successor, according to Ukrainian media, is the Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Shiba. And Ukrainian outlet Bline, I think, say Mr. Kuleba is heading to a new ministry which will oversee Ukrainian regions and temporarily occupied territories. The second name I've picked out is Alexander Kamyshin. He rose to prominence as the man credited with keeping Ukraine's wartime railways moving. Millions of people were evacuated westwards using trains that he kept running as war broke out. The same locomotives were used to bring donations of military and humanitarian aid back. When the siege of Kyiv was broken, scores of Western leaders and celebrities became his passengers as they travelled to Kyiv to offer their support. The former railway boss, who you would often see sporting that traditional Cossack warrior hairstyle, was appointed to oversee Ukraine's domestic production of weapons as the strategic industries minister. His role was basically key in producing these like long-range attack drones and other various weapons that have been vital in lieu of Western support and, as I mentioned, giving Ukraine the ability to hit Russian targets deep inside Russia while Western governments are reticent to do that. And then the third name I have picked out is Ola, and I always pronounce her name wrong, Stefashina, is perhaps the most successful of the candidates facing reshuffle. You might not know her, but she's a deputy prime minister in charge of Euro-Atlantic integration, basically bringing, that's sort of political speak for bringing Ukraine into the EU. She's actually achieved that. Ukraine is on the brink of EU membership. It's going to open negotiations very soon over its membership. She has basically helped drive through democratic and anti-corruption reforms needed to make that membership a political reality. Dom is just messaging in our little group chat that keeps us up that he actually interviewed her and she was seen as a rising star. Oh, no, is that not right, Dom? But yeah, but you are right in saying she's a rising star. I've met her in Brussels a number of times. And I remember one of my interactions with her actually stuck out. I asked her a question about the importance of EU officials and EU governments keeping their promise of letting Ukraine join the EU. And she said it was funny coming from a British journalist, given that Brexit had just happened. But fear not, this rising star, another former lawyer, is expected to remain in a reworked Ukrainian government with added responsibilities, perhaps as justice minister. So this reshuffle isn't just about people being kicked out of positions. It's actually about reshaping how the government looks and potentially giving people promotions. On top of those three that I mentioned, we have Denis Maluska, who's the justice minister, Ruslan Strilats, the Minister of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources, and then Vitaly Koval, the head of the State Property Fund, who have also submitted their resignations. Further resignations and sackings are expected in the coming days. The Ukrainian speaker, Mr. Stefanchuk, has said that their fate, these are people who have handed in their resignations, will be decided by politicians at an upcoming parliamentary session without putting a date on it. What to make of this? So Vladimir Fusenko, who is a Ukrainian political analyst, has said that this could be Mr. Zelensky attempting to avoid, and I quote, stagnation, end quote, in key ministries. This is what Mr. Fusenko was quoted as saying in the New York Times. He thinks that the new people will be more motivated and bring new ideas. But like all and most things that President Zelensky does in terms of reshuffle, he's had a few. I think he's replaced before this about half a dozen or maybe a dozen key positions throughout the war. It will lead to accusations and concerns that Zelensky is basically seeking to strengthen his control and his grip through the presidential office. So Mr. Fusenko said this: in practice, we see that all decisions are made by the president's office. How has Moscow responded to this news? Moscow said the reshuffle would not have any impact on potential negotiations that could happen between Moscow and Kyiv. So Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, no, it will have no impact. You see the attitude to prospects of a negotiation process in the past few days, especially. You can see how tense the situation is. But of course, we are closely following developments. Yeah, so sort of really interesting. And I think this is one that we're going to mention tomorrow, Friday, and possibly on Monday, as we see the makeup of a new Ukrainian government being brought into place.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Joe, for talking us through that. And you're right, it's certainly a story that's developing and one that we'll have to get some analysis from in country as well to help us understand what's changing and what it might mean. Before we come back to Dom, Joe, there's one more story I want to ask you about. So I believe it's your exclusive story, and it combines several elements that we've talked a lot on this podcast about, Germany and Russian spies. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so it's the intriguing story of how Germany, amongst others, are blocking a proposal for tighter restrictions on Russian spies across Europe. So in recent months, amongst all of these sort of allegations and reports that Russia is behind a series of sort of what we describe as a hybrid war against NATO, whether it be blowing up or setting fire to warehouses that have been used to store aid for Ukraine, targeting munitions factories, developing weapons for Ukraine, or targeting railway infrastructure used in the delivery of aid to Ukraine, or just attempts to destabilise the West. Russia has been at the heart of that. And the Czech Republic, so Czechia, had proposed ending free movement for Russian diplomats and their families in the European Union Schengen zone, basically amid the series of Kremlin-inspired attacks. Moscow has repeatedly used intelligence officers in Europe under the guise of diplomatic postings. There's been since then latterly the Skripal poisonings in Salisbury, there has been a huge sort of attempt to crack down on this, but it's seen that some countries are doing more than others. So the EU's free travel zone, that's Schengen, it spans 29 countries. And in a letter that I've seen from Jan Lipavský, who's the Czech foreign minister, he wrote to Joseph Borrell, the sort of EU's top foreign diplomat. He said that the free travel zone was, and I quote, easing malign activities, end quote, across the EU. Lipavský and 8 other EU foreign ministers urged Brussels to restrict the movement of Russian diplomats and their family members to the territory of the state where they are accredited only. They said in this letter, this measure will significantly narrow operational space for Russian agents. So that letter was published in June, or it wasn't published in June, but it was reported by the Politico news website. And in a previously unreported letter, Joseph Borrell, the EU's top foreign diplomat, which I managed to get my hands on, and he actually replies and basically says, look, while I see your letter as a sign of growing support for a collective response, he said there are adverse views on the proposed restrictions. Basically, diplomatic parlance for saying, look, we don't have a consensus on this. It's not going to work for us because we need everyone on board. So I spoke to a host of diplomats, officials. I've reviewed documents as part of this investigation, and they all seem to point their fingers, and figurative fingers because documents can't point fingers, to Germany as the cause of the blockage. So Berlin was prompted of attempting to basically foster relations with Russia, despite promises to end its reliance on previously cheap Russian fossil fuels. So this is what one diplomat told me. So Germany has the approach of returning to business as usual with Russia, and they think this is escalatory. So officially, and this is according to documents I've seen, Berlin is arguing that the move to strip free movement rights from Moscow's foreign envoys would result in similar reprisals. So Berlin fears that its, and I quote, strong presence in Russia could be hamstrung if bans are slapped on the movement of Russian diplomats, basically tit for tat. So there are about 350 German diplomats posted in Russia between embassies in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It did significantly reduce the number of diplomats in Russia after the invasion, about a year after. And this is what the Germans had to say about it. So a German Foreign Office spokesman told me, the Schengen area, without systematic border controls, is one of the most important achievements in Europe. People enjoy freedom of movement within the Schengen area. This also applies to diplomats. The Federal Foreign Office has taken note of the letter from several EU foreign ministers regarding restrictions on the movement of Russian diplomats within the Schengen area. We are currently holding open-ended and unbiased talks with our EU partners on this matter. So basically, they are saying, we want to continue consulate work in Russia for any Germans that may be still in the country. So please don't do this for fear of tit-for-tat reprisals. But they are not the only country arguing this. So Italy, a member of the G7, also emerged as an opponent to the scheme because of the number of Italians living in Russia. So Rome has argued that basically it would not be able to offer consulate services across Russia if the Kremlin responds with tit-for-tat bans on diplomatic movements. And it also voiced support for maintaining, and I quote, open diplomatic channels with Moscow, and said there were other tactics to fight Russian intelligence agencies, and that's according to a diplomat that I spoke to. So yeah, there's a lot of interest in this. We've got at least 9, potentially 10 growing numbers of countries that are willing to suspend free movement for Russian diplomats in the Schengen area, but there are a handful of countries that are blocking it. So interesting development. Talks continue. The Czechs are pushing really, really hard on this. They're trying to get it on the agenda for an upcoming Foreign Affairs Council in Luxembourg, which I believe the UK are going to attend. And as I understand, the UK are actually supportive of this scheme, although they're not in Schengen and never have been. So yeah, it's more to come on that story, but I think that's where we stand on that for now.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and congratulations on the story. It's certainly caused waves amongst Ukraine and Russia and German watchers on the internet, and we'll, of course, include a link to that in our show notes so you can read it yourself, and do come back and update us when this develops, as it surely will. Well, Dom, can I come back to you then at this point? We've seen over the past few days several videos of these new, I don't know entirely what to call them, these sort of dragon drones, these flamethrower drones, dropping fire essentially on Russian positions across the front lines. We've seen enough now to get a sense of what they're about and how they work. I know we can't be too specific. I mean, I know there's a lot of research still to be done, but what are your initial impressions of these new weapon systems? What's your initial reactions as a former military man?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I'm going to rain on your parade a little bit, David. I just caution everyone to take this with a hefty pinch of salt. I'm going to get a little bit wonkish now, if I may. There's a real difference between kit and capability. And what I mean by that is just buying some stuff or making some stuff and shoving it out there, taking a photo of it, getting a video, putting it on social media. That's fine. But that doesn't mean it's an established capability that's in the military locker, if you like. And to turn kit into capability, you need to address all the various lines of development, the defence lines of development, as they're called in the British military. You've got to have, for example, you need a good training regime to know what you're doing with the stuff. You need enough personnel to actually make it a career stream, if you like, or have a cadre of people that work on this thing and know how it's going to develop. And you have to have a logistic tail and lots of other things complete along this what's called, like I say, the defence lines of development. British military call it tepid oil, so you can remember the training, equipment, personnel, infrastructure, doctrine, organisation, information and logistics. And once you've got a sort of a decent enough tick in all of those things, then you've actually got a capability that you can rely on, because, once you've broken it, if you can reach back into the locker and get another one out, then it's capability. If you break it and there's nothing left, it's like, oh, that's not very good. So, this might just be one very successful, or seems quite a successful Ukrainian psychological influence campaign. I mean, we've seen 2 videos of these things now. They might only have 2 of them, but we're all talking about it. It looks very dramatic because it's extremely violent, and you think about, my God, what that must be like to experience that. But, we don't know if they've got loads of these things. They may only, like I say, they may only have these 2. And when you look at what it is, it's actually very low, very slow. It's probably just as noisy as any other drone, and therefore able to be defeated like any other drone with electronic warfare, or some of the short-range, literally shotguns in some places that the troops are now wielding, or the German Gepard system. Anything that can blast a whole load of lead in the sky very, very quickly in the area of one of these things. A drone is, by its very nature, it's quite small. It's not particularly robust. It's not going to put up with a lot of punishment. So this thing is no less vulnerable to all those things that we've been looking at for the last couple of years. What I would say, though, is that this continues the theme of automation, which is where military tech has been going since there was ever military tech. But, look at what's happening in ground forces, unattended or unmanned, or whatever phrase you want to use, unattended ground systems, these little tanks, and sometimes they're sort of 4-legged creatures based on a dog that can get over broken ground. We've seen maritime drones. We've seen them used to huge effect in the Black Sea. Russia, effectively, the Black Sea Fleet is now in Novorossiysk in Russia. It's no longer in Crimea, largely because of the maritime drones that Ukraine has developed. So these things are improving all the time. They're not without vulnerabilities, and every time there's a measure, there's a countermeasure, and then there's a countermeasure, and so on and so forth. That's how military development and innovation goes on. So this points to something. It's a new development because we've not seen these sort of thermal devices. I didn't do chemistry at school, so I wouldn't want to start banding around the term thermite, because someone's going to say, "Dom, what is thermite?" And I'll go, "What's it?" No idea. But it is a development. But until we see lots of these things used in conjunction with other military arms, then I don't take it as seriously as I would other types of military innovation and capabilities. But for now, it's continuing Ukraine's proven track record of innovation. That is very good. But we need more, I think, to say that this is anything other than a notable battlefield experiment.
My feeling about it, Dom, was, and I don't know how you feel, is potentially, because its release was well publicised, this video was released, it was circulated very quickly, you had people texting Roland about it while we were live on the pod. Was it on Friday? It seems to be, it's almost maybe potentially more of a psychological weapon than it is a sort of physical battlefield weapon. I don't know how to sort of phrase the latter. But I just think you see that, and you see these potentially trenches in this tree line being cleared by burning hot, thousands of pieces of trickling aluminium or whatever metals thermite's made of. And it's terrifying. I'm sure no human alive would want to have that rain down on them. So I'm just wondering, is it potentially more of a psychological weapon to basically say, look what we've got, rather than actually a capability that's going to be rolled out wide scale across the front line? I don't know where you sort of stand on that.
Yeah, I mean, that might be what it is. It might be a psychological weapon, and those are weapons in and of themselves. They will have an effect. As you say, it will sort of focus the mind. But, I'm trying to think, well, what would an enemy force do differently if they saw one of these things or suspected they were in the area or just knew that the opposing side had this capability? And it might ratchet up the tension a little bit. But I think if you're in a trench in the Donbass or anywhere else, the tension's pretty high already. And just having this is just an additional innovative and very clever way to die. Soldiers would rely on black humour, I'm pretty sure, at times of great stress. So I don't know how much this is actually going to make them think, oh my God, we've got to do something completely different. Or whether they'll go, oh yeah, what is it this week? Right, it's flamethrower, dragon drones, brilliant. Okay, add it to the list of things to worry about. So until I see an adjustment by the other side somehow, if they bring in kit to specifically counter this type of drone rather than first-person view drones, which have been hugely destructive, as we've seen, then I would say it has limited utility, because the boogeyman is only a boogeyman for as long as you're scared of him. When you turn the light on and see it's just a towel hanging over the back of your chair, you're not scared of the boogeyman anymore. So if this thing doesn't prove to have useful military, it's countered. And if that battle is in the mind, fine, it's more easily countered because you just decide that it's not something new that you need to worry about. So yes, it may just be a psychological weapon which does have utility right up to the moment when you go, you know what, I'm just knackered, I can't be bothered to worry about it anymore.
Coming up, we hear Dom and Joe's final thoughts. Well, thank you, Joe and Dom. Joe, can I come to you first? Thank you so much for your reporting today and for bringing us your stories. Where would you like to end today?
So we often, as journalists, get requests from the desk to look into things when they happen and to basically produce big features for the Sunday newspaper, etc. And one of them was one of the chaps on the foreign desk today came up to me and was like, well, didn't actually physically came up to me, rang me up because I'm in Brussels and they're in London, and said, is there something we can do on Russia and its strikes against Ukraine? And I use the example of Poltava because Louis on the foreign desk was asking, is there something to write about the fact that the Ukrainians warned or revealed that there was basically minutes between this ballistic missile strike hitting before the initial warning or after the initial warning? And I said, yes, there actually is, because it's one of the actual battlefield improvements that we've seen from Russia. And it is the ability to close the loop. Dom would know the actual military term. I've got to look through my notes on this. But essentially, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia was terrible at finding something Ukrainian on the battlefield, whether it be a moving group of troops in ceremonial formation, reporting that back into the system and then hitting it. So often you would find out that Russia had struck 24 hours, 48 hours late, where they believed to be something of military significance. But actually, as the war goes on, they've got a lot better at closing this loop and keeping that timing short. And I think the Poltava example yesterday, if it is true, and we're still yet to have full confirmation of that it was sort of a group of cadets at the military academy there in formation outside. If it is found out that is true, they would have probably had minutes to find that bit of intelligence out, get it back into the system, get the planes in the air, launch the ballistic missiles, have the ballistic missiles hit, and ultimately kill people on the ground. So it's one of the improvements that I say, and I think it's one that I'm going to write a piece on shortly in the next few days or two, so I can report back on that. But yes, I think it's an interesting revelation. It's one that sort of Ukrainian military planners have to be more wary of in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. As you said, it's very much, there's been so many awful strikes recently. That, again, is still very much a developing story. So I'll be interested in your findings once you've investigated it. But Dom, would you like to finish this episode? Dom Nicholls.
Yeah, thanks, David. Just briefly, if I could, talk about escalation management. We had, a few days ago, last week, wasn't it, we had Matthew Saville, the Director of Military Sciences at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, big think tank here based in London. He was on talking about escalation, both vertical escalation and horizontal, and he was helpful in that regard. He was saying, vertical escalation, basically doing more of the same, but with a bigger bang, and horizontal escalation, presenting different but no less thorny problems for your adversary. And I've just been thinking about that in the last couple of days with these, in particular this series of Russian aerial strikes overnight going on for the last few days, in particular last night. And I think by openly targeting civilians, Russia's doing two things. First, Putin is using horizontal escalation to test the West, to see how much he can get away with, see what kind of reaction he gets, but at the same time not escalating vertically and directly ratcheting up the threat to the West. Although you could say, in the long term, if Russia prevails in this war, that's exactly what is going to happen if Russia is not stopped and stopped hard here. But anyway, I'm thinking about the here and now. But second, they're just trying to terrorize Ukraine's population in order to get them to pressurize Zelensky. Okay. Now, the West, Washington, the West, the collective, whatever we're calling it, the collective West, has been terrified of vertical escalation, seeing it's a straight line, if you like, to an eventual nuclear exchange. The West has seen this and has been convinced that Putin is going to act in that way. How has it been convinced? That's a question, but has been convinced that this line does end in a nuclear exchange. And by not fully supporting Ukraine to win, which I define as going back to its 1991 borders, and hiding behind empty phrases like, we're with you for as long as it takes, the West has also been convinced enough that Ukraine will eventually capitulate, that there is a level of pain at which point Zelensky grabs for whatever peace deal he can get. So I've been trying to think, I've been trying to work out why the West is so convinced of both of these positions. Is it just that the mere possibility of any kind of line that ends in a nuclear exchange just trumps everything else? And it may be. But there's been nothing in Ukraine's actions or words that makes me think that there's a level of pain that they won't endure now to keep fighting, because they know that any false peace now will just be the start line for the next war when Russia's rebuilt its arsenal. So I see the problem now for Ukraine is how to convince Washington and the West that they are more serious about enduring pain than Putin is about actually using a nuclear weapon. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if my analysis is correct, but I'd welcome your thoughts on that. Am I seeing it the right way? And what do you think the answer is? But I think that's where we are at the moment in terms of escalation. But I would refer people back to last week's episode with Matthew Saville, when we talked about this. It's a fascinating subject. We will go into more detail again about it with Matthew, hopefully. But yeah, what do you think? What do you think, folks? Be keen to hear your answers.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.